I would love to do what I did with the last panel, which is let everybody put a face to a bio and have each of you introduce yourselves and tell us what you're doing. Jennifer, I'll start with you.
Great. I'm Jennifer Ganton. I'm the Chief Global Affairs Officer at CFS, and I joined the company about 3.5 years ago in the early 100s of the company, so we've scaled significantly since then. And I came with over 20 years of experience doing government affairs and government relations work in the energy sector. But it was a really exciting opportunity to come and do this first-of-a-kind, game-changing thing that was going to happen. I worked in oil and gas for about 20 years before that at Chevron, and had been in charge of the climate strategy at the company when it was time to transition. And it just felt like I got offered a seat on a rocket, and I said, I have to do this.
Great. Mike.
Mike Heiken. I think I'm here in my capacity as an expert advisor to the Strategic Competitive Studies Project today. I'm also on this fusion commission that they've started with Bob and a few other folks.
Wonderful. Dennis.
Hi, I'm Dennis Whyte. So I'm a professor at MIT. I'm one of the co-founders of Commonwealth Fusion Systems, and I ran the MIT side of the collaboration for the first 4 years of the project when CFS got going, culminating in the test of the most powerful magnet the world has ever seen, which was accomplished at MIT in partnership with CFS, and then launching the $2 billion fundraise. And since then, a lot of you know me, I'm wearing lots of hats.
You're all here in some capacity to talk about the government part of this.
Yes.
What I want to ask, just to get us started, each of you, what is, do you think, the most important role that government and governments should take in order to get fusion commercialized and scaled? I'm going to go back down this way, and then we'll just chat.
Start with me?
Yep, start with you.
So I think I've got a very quick list, and we could expand on it. So I think there's two things government must do. It must provide the regulatory environment, because that's the thing that does. Two, it must provide the funding that provides for basic research and education, because that's the sole role of the government in that. There's two things it should do, which is that it should provide some kind of cost savings in a variety of different ways into developing something like this. And it should also provide some, which is different than the regulatory role, it should actually provide some non-biased role as a referee about telling you about what is valid and what's going forward. And the fifth thing is what it shouldn't do. Mm-hmm. It should not try to be a company. It should get out of the way of the private sector and actually allow it to thrive. And all those first four things that it does, it better do that with that spirit in place. So that's my quick list.
Is there anything left? So the way I actually think about
I really
this,
should have started on the
Yeah, no, it's fine. So the Department of Defense always thinks about research, from like a 6.1 through a 6.5 sort of metric, and 6.1 is the most basic research, and 6.5 is sort of the more translational and advanced things that you can deploy. So as I listen to Dennis talk about research and development, I think that 6.1 basic research is important, but finding ways to support industry all the way up the sort of research and development stack is very important. And that means working with folks at MIT and these other places. I think that's an incredibly important piece. I also think on supply chains, and I think we're going to talk about this later, Molly, we're in competition with China, not only sort of in fusion broadly, but also sort of unpack the entire technology from the materials that you need to start building it to sort of all the way through completion. And so as we look at this this industry, one of the things we need to think about is just not what magical energy is going to come to us in the end, but where all the layers of competition are at each level. And the government has a responsibility to identify those and work with industry in partnership to find them and to make sure that we sort of have an advantage.
Yeah, I think about their role sitting on this side of the table as a private company as an enabler and a catalyst to helping us go there fast and get fusion available to everybody in the world and help solve this climate change problem. And so how does that happen? That can happen in many ways. They can create regulatory certainty, and they can look at our product and our technology and regulate it in a way that makes sense and creates public safety, but also doesn't over-regulate it because they just don't understand it. They need to take the time and learn it. They can create incentives through financial incentives that are offered through DOE loans or through programs that Congress passes where they're funding basic research. And so in my mind, I see it as, can the government enable this technology to be available as fast as possible? And they have many tools in their toolkit to do that.
Let's dig into regulation since we're right there with it, because fundamentally, without rules or with rules that are wrong or written for the wrong industry, we don't get where we're going, where we need to go. So talk about, I'm going to come back to you, Jennifer, on this one. Talk about how important it is and it seems like in so many ways, like as we've talked about, CFS is building all kinds of vertical stacks, right? You're like, oh, well, this needs to be solved. I guess it's going to be us.
Yeah. Regulations are paramount. They essentially underpin the business model for the company. How do you create a product that is competitive on the market? The challenge that Fission has had is it cost $1 billion in about 10 years to get your license. You can't really scale an industry when you're facing those challenges.
If you're being regulated like your Fission.
Correct.
Yeah.
That's how Fission's regulated.
Yeah.
Fusion has very different hazards than fission, and the government recognizes that. So it was probably before the company was even started, Bob and others sat around the table and said, one of the most important things we do is get the regulatory environment right and create the pathway that allows for scaling of this industry. That protects the public and does all the things it's supposed to do as a regulator. So we went through an education process with regulators. The UK really led the way on this one, but we were a US company and spent a lot of time in the US focusing on this. And so in my mind, it's table stakes to make sure that it's done right, and that the certainty is in place. They make the decision, they pass the laws, it's codified. That way we know we can build a business in that country, and we know what to expect and how much it's going to cost us in order to build that business. I also think it helps when you have a public discourse about it. There was a lot of public consultation through the regulatory process that we went through. And when you have that public discourse, it also builds trust. And that's an important part of what we're doing as a new industry, is working with the regulators and helping to build that public trust through that process.
Yep. Dennis, I know you have thoughts on this, and also the ways in which different countries are approaching this effectively or not.
Right. So, well, as Jennifer said, the UK actually had the lead in this, and it actually shows the role, in fact, of a concentrated national level program. They realized very quickly that if the UK wanted to have leadership in this area, they needed a very adaptable regulatory framework. So kudos to them. Thank goodness we actually followed them. Thanks a lot to the CFS team, but others as well too. And I think that this is a place where well-run government agencies can actually amplify the efforts which are going on in the public sector, because in the end, the public really, and it's why the government does it, the public wants a voice and a level of detachment from the for-profit company that says, hey, I'm okay with you using this product because it's going to be about the public health in this. So that's going to be good. I think in the US, what we're still coming to while we've got the right framework, we still have to see what the details of this are as well too. And then this is going to be another interesting aspect, because in fusion, it's clear it's not going to be a static set of regulations, and it's because not only about how Commonwealth evolves their technology, but as the other possibly fusion efforts come along, there's going to have to be adaptations, in fact, about the realities of this. So I hope that we see something which is more adaptable and more flexible and more appropriate than what we have in fission, because if we don't have that, it's going to. It's interesting. I was the head of the nuclear science and engineering department for a while at MIT, and I was grossly surprised by the lack of innovation in the industry. And I think it's been one of its problems about staying competitive. And part of it was they were so scared of any any change because of the regulatory aspects it would have. I don't think we should do that, or should do that for fusion, because I think it's going to be very bad for it's going to impede a lot of innovations to make fusion more cost effective and therefore more widely deployed.
Right.
I'll add
Please.
to that. I mean, it came up on the other panel that fusion's hard.
Right.
This is hard too. It takes a lot of work, it takes a lot of education, it takes a lot of engagement, it takes a strategy. And I think that was one of the things when I came to this company, I was so surprised that a small company in a new industry had put together the strategy that an entire industry would be underpinned by. And they went out and they started executing it. Mm-hmm. And they relentlessly executed it. And then they went and taught the other companies how to execute on it. And they started an industry association. That's the ground game that we did in the US. That ground game has to happen in every country. So it's a big endeavor, and it's really important, but it is a lot of work.
But it's a key one, is speaking of the international competitive landscape. So when a certain country leads in developing a technology, they also usually lead in exporting the environment, the regulatory environment around it as well too. This is so beyond the perhaps enormous economic things, the social, political, the geopolitical influences that come from a country like China exporting their technology with their environment, with their with their regulatory environment, could be very big as well too.
Right, and that leads nicely into Mike and your long national security expertise. Like, we tend to talk about the competition between companies and even countries in purely economic terms, but how do you think about this as a question of geopolitics in terms of who gets there first?
So listen, there's a few areas of like actual strategic competition with China right now. Fusion is one of them, bio is one of them. We already heard the last panel talk about AI, and then quantum is another area of incredible strategic competition. As we look at those areas, the government has a responsibility to make sure that we're working hand in glove with industry, whether it's the fusion industry or the AI industry and the other places. That means a few things. It means the funding that Dennis was talking about at the very beginning. It also means creating a regulatory environment that allows for innovation to happen and also allows for infrastructure and construction to happen, because a lot of times these come down to permitting issues and a variety of other things. Just listening to the two of them, I sort of like put my government hat on for a second. And every time I've taken a briefing from the Department of Defense or Department of Energy over the years, you sort of listen to the executive branch folks tell you about all these terrible regulations, and then you have to ask them at some point, okay, are these regulations that Congress has imposed on you or you have unilaterally imposed on yourself? And a lot of times it's the latter. And so, hearing the conversation about strategy is, as investors think about this industry, one of the things you should unpack at every level is, are these actual legal US code restrictions that are being imposed on industry, or are these things that the Department of Energy or other elements have created for themselves, largely to protect them against some of the historic things we thought about some of these technologies. And so, again, as investors look at this, unpack that sort of legal framework and figure out, sort of where to point the finger. Because a lot of times people are like, well, Congress needs to fix this. And you're like, but we didn't do anything. So, it's one of these things that you should always sort of spend some time educating yourself on. But one of the things just to mention on sort of the competition with China is, next year is 2025, and China has this strategy called Made in China 2025. So next year is a big year for them as they think about what technologies to invest in. Semaphore had an amazing piece, I think it was last week or the week before, on their big investment and play in fusion. And we've seen a number of these other things over the last few years. And so you should expect that to continue. And that's one of the things that the US government should take as sort of a canary in the coal mine sort of moment to say, okay, we see China making these public announcements. We have to assume, just knowing our adversary, that they are making investments that are far greater than these public numbers and are trying to advance this technology in an area of strategic competition.
We can see the pictures. There's buildings, right? And they're not empty as well too. Just a quick one is an interesting one of where I was on a National Academies panel of discussing about what it would look like to think about deploying the first one. We call it a pilot plant, right? That's what ARC would be for CFS. And it's and I remember this conversation, that it was clearly going to be beneficial to build the pilot plant at a national lab under DOE rules. And I was just like, what are you talking about? Yeah. It's just like, this is where the government, because they think, because we're going to know best because we're the government and we can make our own regulations, but those will never apply in the private sector. So that's an instance where the sort of instinct is often incorrect about the place where the government can be effective.
Well, and this, that a lot of these technologies have been sort of historically treated in the non-proliferation space.
Right.
And sometimes, you have to educate, I hate to say that, but it sort of has to educate some folks in the government to sort of say, well, this is fundamentally different. We have to think about this in a different way.
Yeah.
But that doesn't just happen overnight. That takes sort of not one meeting or two meetings, but sort of 20 meetings and meeting at every echelon within an organization.
And then there's an administration change and you go to all the meetings again.
No, and it is amazing. Because I get this interesting perch because I sit on kind of all sides of this. I see my public sector colleagues struggling with like the evolution of what fusion looks like. But I try to comfort them in saying, like, this is also not new. Like when you take a look at, and my colleague and I, Andrew Lowe, we wrote an article recently about this, about the similarities between biotech and fusion. It went through this as well too. There were big public food fights, about what does the government do and what does the private sector do. And you'll sort it out eventually, but it's like you got to realize this is a good thing that it's not just a public program anymore. It's a good thing that there's a fusion energy industry. That means that all that work that was done in the public sector actually is leading to something important
Yeah.
as well.
And we're trying to take a leadership role at CFS in thinking about this as an ecosystem that is both the public sector work that is happening and the private sector work that's happening. And there's a lot of good things that can happen in the public sector at the national labs and in academia and other places. There are really smart people doing great things. But how do we get them to think about this will be a commercial endeavor? The commercial companies are going to get us there. How can they enable and help and support the commercial sector? It's a big ship to turn to have them stop thinking about basic science and I have a thought or a hypothesis that I want to test out, I'm going to go do that, to say, here's what the industry needs. There was a roadmap developed several years ago where the community came together and said, if we're going to have a commercial fusion industry, these are the things we should do. Unfortunately, we've not been able to execute a lot of that. It's been a little bit of lack of funding, which we're trying to get more appropriations from Congress to put more money there. But it has also been a change in mindset within this ecosystem. So we're trying to spend a lot of time convening people, bringing private and public together, trying to shift to, if you just solved this problem, it would help all the fusion companies and it could be a catalyst to us going faster.
It does raise this question about private dollars, right? We talked on the last panel about how there is going to have to be probably private capital coming in, which does tend to create a schism or sometimes a distrust or sometimes a sense that, oh, we're really going to have to regulate this thing because it's purely commercial and it can't be trusted. And I wonder how you think about approaching that conversation.
I don't think that's necessarily true. I think that in this space, listen, the Department of Energy is going to have a role here. And it will be a substantial role and it'll be an enduring role. At the same time, we've seen the Department of Energy, work hand in glove with industry in other areas.
Yes,
Fossil fuels. The Department of Energy was created because of fossil fuels and nuclear weapons. But that's something that I think you do see for all the time. And then just listening to the last answer, the other thing the government does do well is as private industry sort of hits difficult to solve problems, there are unbelievable numbers of people in these national labs that have expertise in all kinds of places. And they routinely do reach into companies and say, okay, Dennis, we know you're struggling with this problem. We heard you're struggling with this problem. Let's sit down and do some of the hard science and engineering. And it's incredible. You can watch some of these government scientists take a problem, unpack it with a company, and accelerate through the problem. It happens every day. It happens on like the tiniest little widget you can possibly imagine.
Yep.
And it happens at scale at big companies and at companies like, I'm sure, CFS over the years
well,
too.
when we constructed CFS, it was, I remember the chart we made in the Spark sweat room where we were laying all this out. And we realized that, that was actually why some of us as founders stayed at MIT and stayed more on the public side, because part of it was realizing you're still going to need innovators in that space. You need deep thinkers in that space. Yep. And you need access to them. And it was probably about a month ago, Bob, there was like this one particular problem. We were trying to sort it out. It was kind of a really, don't worry, it's a really nerdy problem. But it's like, and guess what? We got some really amazing nerds that actually figured it out and sorted it out. And that's really important. But it's interesting to what does the public sector bring? Because there's a class, at a larger scale, there's a class of kind of challenges in something like fusion and new technology. This is why DOE has national labs, to provide platforms which are difficult for single companies to provide, but then they're tied into those things. And here's just the deeply frustrated, because I was one of the, through the national academies and other ones, I was one of the architects of saying in the public sector, the US should be doing these things because they're going to lift all the boats. And it is being built in China.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, no, the national labs are incredible places because they, they help folks like CFS. They find sort of the next generation of companies and help them and sort of figure out if their technologies are going to be helpful. And the other thing they do is they sort of smoke out where the Chinese are and Chinese companies are, and they sort of say, okay, like this is definitely an area of competition.
Yeah. The thing you have to be really smart about when you're a private company, though, is what do I collaborate on?
Right.
And what is really something we need to be building the muscle inside. We need to have that capability. We want to own that IP. When you collaborate with the government, there are some strings that sometimes come with that. So we have a team in CFS that thinks very deeply about this, and that's called Open Innovation, and they find the right strategic problems that make sense in the public sector. But you also have to have the long-term vision of, I'm building a company. And so what do I do inside, and what do I collaborate on, and what do I get other people to do work on? That it's not a partnership, and it's great if they do it and it benefits, but it doesn't sort of put any strings on my company as I scale and grow.
Mm-hmm.
But we can't forget the other thing the government brings: lots and lots of money.
Well, we wish. We
Yeah,
wish the US government brought lots
wish
and lots
to
of
it,
money.
and no, because I have to point out this is, and I think Clay commented this very correctly. There are multiple pathways, to making something like this happen, and what I see, and what's the race kind of now is between three different systems. We heard a lot about the American one, CFS being the leader in that. The UK actually has a significant national program. I would call it's kind of a very, being Canadian originally, it's what we call a crown corporation. It's essentially, it's a corporation which is incorporated by the government, with the majority shareholder being the government, but it's still run like a corporation because it's in the national interest. And then there's a centrally planned, pretty much government-centric one, which will happen in China. It is it's an intriguing question, right? Because I think there are pluses and minuses in each of them. The long-term planning and deep pockets that come from a central plan, has got some validity in it, right? But it lacks, but the innovations and drive towards a commercially relevant product are the things that thrive in the other system. So it's just like, can't we just have our cake and eat it too? Here, because we've got a powerful and wealthy government. If it just got its shoulders behind this in the right way, we could actually, I think, get the best of both worlds on this.
Yeah, listen, government funding is always a crawl, walk, run endeavor. Mm-hmm. And I think as companies like CFS continue to sort of build confidence with the government, that you'll see the government continue to invest in those key places, and will continue to surge dollars into it. So, as the facility in Massachusetts gets stood up, that will be an important sort of trust and confidence building measure, and also, honestly, probably a demand signal from the private sector too, to pour more resources in. Yeah. But the government does need to see those steps, and undoubtedly, as you have those conversations with Congress, and I know you guys do, make sure you sort of put it in that sort of metrics.
Fine. Last question as we wrap up here, Jennifer, and actually to the panel and specifically, what would it look like for the U.S. government to get this right? Is it all the way to Apollo project, or is it somewhere in between?
Well, they're on the road to the regulatory certainty that we want.
Yeah.
A few more I's to dot and T's to cross, as Dennis pointed out. So that's table stakes. Thinking about how they invest in fusion, spend about, the budget today on an annual basis is about $850 million that's spent into fusion by the government. The majority of that are mortgages on some older machines, some larger multinational projects like ITER. We're not seeing the type of investment that we would like to see that can catalyze some of this R&D that we were talking about. And more importantly, as we talked about this earlier, how are we standing up an industry? Where are the incentives coming from that are going to help move this through to the first power plant and then the next power plant? So we think about DOE loan programs, things like that. How accessible are they going to be? That changes with administrations, but that should be we should feel there's consistency and certainty that that's coming. We don't necessarily always feel that. And then what are the incentives in place? I think about all the things that have passed of recent where we have tax equity credits and things like that fusion qualifies for. That makes a huge difference for us in taking off capital costs at the front of our projects. So are there more ways to think about incentivizing that and keeping it technology neutral so that fusion is included? We're not asking for special treatment. We're being asked, can we compete on a level playing field, and we will win with our technology, but we need to have access to that. So I think there's more funding, there's more programs that they make sure they're technology neutral, that help to incentivize and reduce the upfront capital costs on some of these early new technologies like fusion. Big pieces that have to get done.
Yep.
I would say on the $850 million, $850?
$850 million is about they spend
so if
a
it's
year in
$850 million,
appropriations.
you should assume that each year Congress is probably going to try to keep that number flat.
That's what
So the thing that you're going to be the most effective conversation to have with Congress is, okay, where is that money going now and where should we reallocate it to sort of help industry scale? And so that's a conversation I'm sure you guys are having with Congress. And then if there are opportunities through, the renewal of the Trump tax cuts next year or another reconciliation cycle or something like that, there can always be opportunities to say, okay, guys, we need to surge some additional capital into this space to solve some very discrete problems. And that can be either in terms of actual dollars or tax relief or other sort of mechanisms that the government has available to it, like the loan program that you mentioned. And a lot of those things do survive transitions of administrations. It's always just about finding the belly button that you want to sort of get to.
Yeah.
Sorry, Dennis, go ahead.
No, absolutely. So we got to actually, I'll pick an even nastier term. It's underwater mortgages, actually, which often happens when new and Clay and others had it right. It's like what's actually happened was it caught, like the government programs kind of got caught unawares of these major technical advances.
But wait. But what does it look like for them to do it right?
So right. So you do that, free up some money, and then the way that you do it right is you put in large amounts of money, but you don't put your thumb on the scale. Yeah. And by picking winners, and we already know what this looks like. It's a cost-sharing program or a milestone-driven program. We've been vastly successful at this, and things like SpaceX is a particular model of this. This is absolutely what we should do. I think it's and the reason I think it works is because it's kind of in the U.S. Vibe, right? Is like the government shouldn't pick, the market should pick the winners in the end. But the government can help, particularly with the first movers, about getting that over the line. And that's actually what it should do.
Wonderful.
And that's what success looks like.
I want to thank all of our panelists and Bob and all of you for your patience. I appreciate it. And I want to leave you with a reminder, Bob and I had the chance to geek out a little tiny bit to talk about this. If we stipulate that we are close and closer than people outside this room think, then I just have to remind you before we go that instead of thinking that our kids will grow up in like some sort of dystopian nightmare, imagine them growing up in an energy utopia. Like really imagine the problems that we can solve if we get this right, and then write checks accordingly. Have a great night.